Hi, everyone. I'm Jasenia from BLM Morristown. Thank you all so much for being here today with us for this incredibly relevant and necessary conversation. Before we get started, I just want to ask you all a couple of questions to really get you thinking about the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Feel free to either pop your answers in the chat box. You can even unmute yourself and share out loud if you'd like, or you can keep your answers to yourself. Whatever you'd like is more than okay. So when you think of the police, what do you think of?
I know personally when I see police, I live in DC, well, near DC, so I was there when Biden got the president-elect. So I went down to DC, and there was a group of police officers, and my immediate reaction was to just like stop and like stare. And when I think of the word police, I get a pit in my stomach. I think I get scared. I think of fear instead of protection.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, just
It's a little,
looking at what the chat box, what's going on in the chat box, a lot of folks definitely share the sentiment that you just expressed. Kai, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I'm reading from the chat: above the law, unchecked power. Those are all, very, very powerful thoughts. And, I think a lot of people definitely share those sentiments. Um, what do the police do? Seems like a simple question. So any answers are more than okay. If you want to share out loud, thank you for those that are answering in the chat. Serve the 1%.
my.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry. Okay. Serve the colonial class, keep quote unquote us safe, exert control to maintain power. Yep, those are all great answers. Whatever answer you have, it's just whatever your thoughts are. Thank you so much for participating and giving your answers in the chat. How many crimes do police prevent? Keyword there being prevent. Okay, I'm seeing answers in the group chat saying 0, none. They don't question mark, none or close to none. Okay, these are all great answers. Thank you so much for sharing. So do our beliefs really mirror reality? A lot of times, if you speak to people, they're convinced that police are out here stopping and preventing crime. And those views are largely thanks to propaganda and mainstream media. But if you really sit down and think about it, police are in fact reactive and not proactive. They really don't prevent any crimes, and crime control is an incredibly small part of policing, and it always has been. So I just want to backtrack a little before we move on and touch upon something that I just said. Our view of police is largely shaped thanks to propaganda and mainstream media. Think about shows like Cops, First 48, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. This is all very intentional, and it dates back to the 60s and 70s, where Hollywood was actually helping LAPD manufacture a professional image for itself in the wake of the 1965 Watts riots. Today, all over the TV, we see police dramas and reality TV shows with similar kind of messaging and purpose. Some are more nuanced than others, but by and large, these shows portray the police as struggling to fight crime in, sometimes with like morally contradictory environment. But even when police are portrayed as corrupt or brutal, it's understood that their primary motivation is to get the bad guys. So just let that marinate for a second. Also, just a quick reminder that please mute yourself if you are not mute right now. We'll definitely have time to further discuss everything that we're going over. So Moving on, as I mentioned earlier, cops don't actually prevent any crimes, and they do very, very little crime control. Um, we can easily determine this just by analyzing how police spend their time when they're working. So the New York Times actually ran like an informal study where they analyzed calls to service data from 10 US cities. And so this data included like burglar alarms, calls from citizens to 911 or non-emergency police lines, and even radio calls from officers themselves, pretty much any call that resulted in dispatching of police. And data showed that only 1% of all those calls to the 10 agencies were for serious violent crimes, including homicide, robberies, rapes, or aggravated assault. And on average, these officers spent no more than 4% of their time investigating major violent crimes. So felony arrests of any kind are really a rarity for uniformed officers, with most making no more than one felony arrest a year. The bulk of police officers work in patrol, so they take reports, they engage in random patrol, they address parking and driving violations, noise complaints, things like that, like misdemeanor arrests for maybe possession of drugs or like vague disorderly conduct. So really isn't a lot of felony arrests. And actually, Alex Vitale, he's the author of The End of Policing, shadowed patrols for his book. And the patrols, or the cops themselves, were quoted as saying 99%, they were describing their days as 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror. And even that 1% is a bit of an exaggeration for most officers. So as we can see, they don't even spend a lot of their time controlling crime. So if we take a look at this graph, this is really comparing the overall crime rate with the overall violent crime rate, and then state and local spending on police per person. So this is comparing them over time from the 1960s to 2008, adjusted for inflation. So in 1960, about $2 billion was spent by state and local governments on police. By 1980, that spending had increased to 14.6 billion, and we can see that crime rates soared. But over the next 2 decades, those rates fell drastically, but we can see that spending still spiked to more than $67 billion. By 2018, which is the most recent year for which full data is available, crime rates have plummeted, and yet police spending has increased exponentially. Even in recent years, when national spending per person has dropped, crime hasn't risen. In 2006, the US spent about 386 per person on state and local police, with like crime rates around 3,800 per 100,000 people. But we can see that even when spending was cut, crime still continue to fall. So why are we spending more money on police when the crime rate is still going down? And even when spending goes up a little, like the spending doesn't have any effect on the crime. So more spending in a year hasn't significantly correlated to less crime or more crime. So I saw a question asked, what was the name of the book? It's called The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. Okay, so today's session is going to focus, now that we got a little bit of background, is going to focus on the history of policing and introducing the concept of defunding and abolition. Please keep in mind that what we discussed today is going to be super, super brief introductions and overviews of these 3 topics. There are scholars, organizers, and activists that dedicate literally their entire careers to researching and discussing what we're presenting today. So at the end of the session, we're going to share some great resources to continuing your education on these topics, and highly, highly encourage you all to do your own research on your own time. Also, if you see me glancing over, I just have notes. I have two screens, so I apologize for that. It's really imperative to learn about the history of policing in order to understand why the system itself is so inherently racist. That's why we wanted to start off this series with reviewing the history of policing in America. There is not a single era in US history in which the police force were not a force of violence against historically marginalized groups of people. Before we dive into the history, though, I do want to briefly go over the two schools of police reform thought, which is defunding and abolition. So think of defunding as like an unbundling of the police. The basic idea behind it is to have like a substantial reduction of police department budgets. So pretty much government officials should narrow the scope of officers' duties. They should then pivot some of that police funding to groups better suited to handle tasks that used to fall under law enforcement's purview. Two areas that regularly come up in unbundling or defunding the police happen to be the same ones that the New York Times found take up a large portion of officers' days, which is traffic incidents and non-criminal calls. Abolition, on the other side, or abolitionists, believe that procedural reforms can't fix policing because it's an inherently racist tool of social control. Again, going back to Alex Vitale's book, he argues that any real agenda for police reform must replace police with empowered communities working to solve their own problems. While defunding might be like a step towards abolition, the central idea in abolition is much larger and much more transformative. Abolition at its core is really like a bigger idea than just firing cops and closing prisons, though. It includes eliminating the reasons people think they need cops and prisons in the first place. So we redirect those billions that now or currently go to police department toward providing healthcare, housing, education, stable jobs. If we did this, there would be less need for the police in the first place. We find that crime is, instead of crime being tied or correlating with how much funding a police has, crime is actually correlated between poverty and this instability that we just mentioned. So we can build other ways of responding to harms in our society. Trained community care workers can do mental health checks. Towns can use restorative justice models instead of throwing people in prison. And in my research and in conversations with people, a lot of times people ask like, oh, well, what about like victims of rape or things like that? Well, the current approach that we have hasn't ended rape either. In fact, most rapists have never seen the inside of a courtroom. So, and 2/3 of people who experience sexual violence never report it to anyone. So like I mentioned before, police aren't actually preventing rape, and the system rarely even convicts rapists. In abolition, restorative justice would really take a central role in decreasing rape and also in addressing the needs of victims of rape as well. So now we're going to move, oh, sorry.
No worries. Just as Jasenia was saying, now we're going to take a minute. I know there was a lot of information thrown at you, but let's just take a minute. Look at all of these images here. Take a minute for those photos to really set in. Let it soak in. Take a quick glance as much as you can. These visuals are very important in order to understand the history of policing. And I hope you can just soak this in and see the images themselves and try to understand what we will be diving into throughout this presentation.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be just going over a brief history of policing following this timeline. So we're seeing that the beginnings of policing, although they weren't formal policing, we can trace back the beginnings of policing in the US all the way back to slavery, with slave patrols, curfew laws, things like the slave pass, and even during Reconstruction, which post-war, post-Civil War, was an era where formerly enslaved folks, you know, had a lot of new opportunities. So we can see the role that police played even during those times, and especially during those times. We can also, then we're also going to dive into the history of policing through the early 1920s and all the way through modern times. So the reality is that police exist primarily as a system for managing and even producing inequality by suppressing social movements and tightly managing the behaviors of poor and BIPOC folks. And we clearly see that when we look back at the era of American slavery. So policing is among the vestiges of slavery, tailored in America to suppress slave revolts, catch runaways, and repress labor organizing. Although organized police practices were adopted to the colonies from England, which we'll later talk about, there is another significant origin of American policing that we can't forget, and that's slave patrols. Policing in the South emerged from slave patrols in the late 1600s through the 1800s, and pretty much they function as catching and returning runaway slaves. They would chase down, apprehend, and return enslaved folks to their owners. They provided a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts and slaves from running away. So just like slave owners, they beat and terror. Slave patrols also beat and terrorized enslaved people as well. The very clear distinction, though, was that they were legally compelled to do that. Slave patrols were, it was seen as like their civic duty to do this, which is really interesting when we see those parallels today. And there were some areas where if you were a slave patrol and you weren't violent towards enslaved people, then you could actually get a fine, which is insane. And then other patrollers received financial compensation for their work. So slave patrol routines included enforcing curfews, checking travelers for a permission pass, which this is what the slave pass was. If there were enslaved folks walking around through town, a lot of times they had to have a pass from their owners that proved that they weren't trying to run away. And then slave patrols would catch those assembling without permission, and they would prevent any form of organized resistance. Okay, in the North, a lot of times we think that, you know, these slave patrols only existed in the South, but actually in the North, police departments were very much or police patrols were very much involved in this as well. But they also helped quash labor strikes, control immigrants, and any kind of riots against the rich. After the Civil War, Southern police departments often carried over those patrols and kind of mirrored the same things that the slave patrols were doing. These included systematic surveillance, the enforcement of curfews, and even who could become a police officer, because back then formerly enslaved people and people of color, Black folks, could not become a police officer. During the Jim Crow era, policing was a central tool of maintaining racial inequalities in the South. Vigilantes like the Ku Klux Klan often worked closely and were part of the local police. And in the North, political leaders feared northern migration of newly freed runaways, who they still saw as inferior. So they established ghettos to control the growing Black population. And police played a major role in the containment of these ghettos.
Hello,
So Marwa, before we jump into this section, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to check the chat box, or any thoughts on what we just went over. So Kaya said, the parallel of preventing organized resistance can be seen today with the police reaction to BLM protests? Absolutely. I mean, it's insane when you start tracing back history that the same tactics of, you know, quelling slavery, like slave revolts, quelling like labor movements in the early 1800s is exactly what they're still doing today, which is why it's so important to really study the history of policing in the US, because we can see exactly what they were doing back in the 1700s is what they're still doing today in 2020. So insane when
And
we think about that.
Jasenia, there was one question earlier when you were asking about whether or not police actually prevent crime. And the question was, the fear they create, does that prevent crime?
Interesting. That's a
So,
really interesting question. I mean, I definitely open that up for anyone to answer if you have any thoughts on that. I think to an extent it might. I definitely see that, especially early on. I think personally, okay, so Karina said that that question may be answered later on in the presentation. I think we're kind of, if I'm speaking on my personal opinion, I think that we're kind of getting to the point where we're becoming, a lot of folks are becoming aware of, you know, the brutality and the corruption of the police force. So they're almost like not afraid of them, but that whole fear of policing definitely can be seen throughout history and can still be seen today. I think so. I saw someone raise their hand. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can
Good.
ask. Oh yeah. Hi, how are you?
Hi, this is Ashina from Jersey City.
Hi, Sheena.
To the in reference to the person that that was the person that asked the question about the fear that police create, it's important to note, and it was lightly touched when you were going over the history, that the police were made to inflict fear on the slaves so that they wouldn't leave and they wouldn't revolt. And so that can transcend into now, and that police are, they're told to, you know, to be intimidating and for people to be fearful of them so that things don't happen. So I agree with the person that asked that question, that yes, the intimidation factor may prevent people from doing things because they don't want to be apprehended by the police. I had another comment in regard to the history. It's important to note when you're talking about the history with the slave patrols that, number one, they were Black slaves, and you know that transcends in today how Black people are treated. But it's also important to note that slaves were not seen as human beings; they were property. Yeah. So it was as if, you know, their cow or their horse or their dog had run away, and it was catch them at all costs and bring them back dead or alive. And the reason why I note that is because it's important not only for us to understand it, but for police who are of color to understand the history of the institution that they are serving, and that their job is not necessarily to defend that institution, but to change it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Those are extremely, extremely insightful and thought-provoking feedback, because it's absolutely true. And later on in the presentation, we touch upon that as well, you know, that intersection with racism and even capitalism and colonialism. But your point of you know, current day Black police officers and people of color, to keep that in mind, it's definitely important. And again, I just want to reiterate the point. This is why it's so important to learn the history of policing, and trace back those origins, because it's just, we see this still, you know, affecting today. Thank you all so much for your feedback and your thoughts in the group chat. It's really, really insightful and really helpful as well. So.
Yeah, I also wanted to touch on that question about do police's fear prevent crime? And it's really interesting to look at, as we saw earlier, is that even in places where you amp up the police presence, it does not show a decrease in crime. And we're going to see why that is, and partially because crime is actually a social construct, but we'll get into that later. And before I proceed also, I want to say that Alex Vitale, the author of The End of Policing, is coming to Drew next semester. So so keep that in mind too. I'm very excited. As we just saw, whereas the genesis of the modern police organization in the South is the slave patrol, we examine a different story in the North. So along with slavery, it is imperative to think about the creation of police in the context of not only capitalism, but also colonialism. And I'm more so going to focus on the former, that is capitalism. I'm also going to begin with London because the development of policing in the US has been inspired by the development of policing in London. So capitalist development engendered widespread poverty and displacement of skilled workers. So movements across England were occurring, asking for political reforms. And in 1819, tens of thousands of people gathered in central Manchester, and a cavalry charge with sabers killed many protesters and injured several hundreds more. This was known as the Peterloo Massacre, and it was actually the event that signaled that England needed a police force. So what's really interesting is Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister of England at the time, he created the London Metropolitan Police. And this idea was stemmed from the British colonial occupation of Ireland at the time. And they formed a police force there to maintain colonial domination. So the LMP, their functions were to protect property, quell riots, put down strikes, and produce a disciplined workforce. And as we'll see, this system was adapted throughout all England because the non-professional constables and militias were unable to contain these political movements against industrialization and enforce vagrancy laws, which were only passed because it forced people into work. And that's what I meant about what is constituted as a crime. And eventually, the London model was imported into Boston in 1838 and spread to other northern cities, as we'll see right now. So, policing in colonial America. It was informal. It was based on a for-profit system that employed people part-time. There were also night watch systems that volunteers signed up for. But these systems were really ineffective because watchmen usually slept or drank on duty. And also keep in mind, they were often there to evade military service or as a form of punishment. So in the 1830s, urbanization was occurring at a rapid pace, and this rendered this old informal watch system as inadequate. However, evidence of a crime wave was lacking. So what was the modern police force actually a response to? So more than crime, the modern police force emerged as a response to so-called disorder. And it is an imperative to think about what is considered social and public order and what is considered crime is always based on who is defining these terms. So in the cities of the 19th century America, they were defined by mercantile interests, who through taxes and political influence supported the creation of police. So these commercial elites needed a mechanism or a socialized system of social order to ensure a stable and disciplined workforce for the system of factory production, and also a stable and orderly environment for their business conduct. Meanwhile, inequality was rapidly increasing. We saw exploitation of workers, long work days, dangerous working conditions, low pay, and we also saw the dominance of local governments by economic elites, and this only induced more political arrest. And the only way that these workers were able to challenge the system was through rioting. So when we think about public drunkenness or crime or political arrest and all these things, they were products of the economic and social injustice at the time. But these elites were very smart, and to combat the threat from the working class, they produced propaganda that basically said that these things like crime and political protests were actually products of a biologically inferior, immoral, unskilled, and uneducated underclass. So we see the passing and enforcement of nativist morality laws, which the real purpose of these laws was to target the underclass, consisting primarily of foreign immigrants, of the poor, of freed, formerly Black slaves. So the main takeaway here is the modern police force did not only provide this organized mechanism to maintain order, but it also provided this illusion that this order was being maintained under the rule of law and not at the whim of those in economic power. Moreover, the targeting of these so-called dangerous classes as the embodiment of the crime problem created a focus in crime control that we see today. This idea that policing should target so-called bad individuals rather than focusing on the social and economic conditions that are causing social upheaval and crime. So on to the professionalization of police. The creation of police did not only lead to widespread enforcement of vice laws and the criminal code, but it also opened the door to widespread corruption. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, police were really under control of local politicians. They took payoffs to allow illegal drinking, gambling, and prostitution. They helped organized crime. For instance, they would help white gangs intimidate voters of color. There were no civil service exams. There was no formal training. You essentially bought your way into being a police officer. So it was corruption at any corner you can get. So when journalists, business leaders, religious leaders all began to expose police corruption, we see this professionalization of police throughout the 19th and 20th centuries through various forms like centralized hiring processes, technology, and so forth. However, what's really important to note here is that police professionalism only heightened tensions between the police and communities. The crime control tactics of professionalization, of this professionalization movement, only such as aggressive stop and frisk, these things only created widespread community resentment. And these tactics were designed against minorities and immigrants, and they were rarely tolerated when applied against the middle and upper classes. So along with these reform efforts of professionalization, August Vollmer, he is a very well-known figure in the history of policing. He developed this idea of police as scientific crime fighters. So we also see an increased reliance on technology and science, such as lie detectors or fingerprints. But we know that these technologies are very faulty to this day. And the emphasis on efficiency and crime fighting has also de-emphasized and discouraged the social work aspect of policing. So we see the police being isolated from the public and immune to any criticism during this time throughout these centuries because they shielded themselves under the guise of science, despite how faulty the tactics were and are. Karina later in the slides will go over surveillance very briefly, which I think is a very fascinating but also disturbing aspect of policing. So on to the 1960s. By this time, massive social and political changes were also occurring in the US. Professional police forces served to suppress the civil rights movements in the South. For instance, they denied protest permits, they threatened and beat demonstrators, and they made discriminatory arrests. In the North, it was a slightly different story. The suppression was more nuanced at first. It was mixed. However, when radical groups became more organized and grew, then overt violence followed. So, and something else I want to add, one of the forms of repressive tactics in the North was the development of red squads. And these were essentially police intelligence units that spied on and worked to undermine groups like the Black Panthers. And it even led to assassinations of prominent leaders such as Fred Hampton and of the Black Panthers, as we see. Essentially, Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Black Panthers, he was assassinated by the police while he was sleeping in his bed next to his wife. So, a really important thing to consider when we're thinking about the suppression of these radical movements, they were actually based on counterinsurgency tactics from foreign policy during that era. So I'm going to focus on something called the Office of Public Safety, which I think is a pretty ironic name for that. So essentially, this new professionalization movement, so this group, it was created to, essentially, it was, it worked in the Cold War, in the areas of Cold War conflict. So this agency, it was built in lots of countries, and the officers, they committed lots of human rights violations. They were trained in lots of counterinsurgency areas such as espionage and bomb making and interrogation techniques. And what's really interesting is lots of the police in this agency actually moved to American law enforcement, like the FBI and the state and local police force, after having to work in the Office of Public Safety. So, and something else I want to add, just one second. Yeah, so what's really interesting too is this actually led to colossal funding for federal police under the Johnson administration, because the director of the Office of Public Safety, he actually testified to the government that they have successfully countered all these social movements abroad. So that means they could successfully counter all these radical movements in the US. So here we see that this professionalization movement and the expanded funding did not actually reduce policing. It was not in a response to crime, but actually a response to social movements. So this professionalization and expanded funding only enhanced police power and led to the development of SWAT teams and mass incarceration. And like Jasenia was mentioning earlier, a lot of this money also went to cosmetic police community relations and improving the police's image in the media.
So now we're going to move forward and try to explain and create this shift and this transition to contemporary policing now. So I hope you can see the images that we have while I talk, because they're really important to understanding. Again, through these slides, we see the outlook on policing evolve, but they are still stemmed in racism and aggressive tactics, as we see here. And remember, we went from discussing slave patrolling to the London Metropolitan Police, where it derived from, to modern policing. And again, they both hold that same underlying roots in racism, as well as plenty of other factors we're going to go into. Now, as mentioned here, in the PowerPoint, you can see presidents like Nixon mobilized these fears of racial tensions through the law and order notion that I think I saw was mentioned earlier in the chat. So thank you for bringing that up. This law and order idea aiming to persuade Southern whites to vote for the Republicans for the first time since the Reconstruction period. The scope of policing also expanded as a result of mass incarceration and the federal crime bill in 1994, which also overturned an amendment under the Higher Education Act of 1965, which got rid of the opportunity for prison inmates to receive a college education during their imprisonment. Punishment or rehabilitation? That's another question to ask yourself when learning about the history of policing as well. Now, with the economy crashing in the 1970s, creating a permanent lower class, the government responded by managing Black surplus population through intensive policing and mass incarceration. Is that the answer? Those specific practices, again, were aided by ideologies like the broken windows theory, which I'll go further into detail after this slide. We also have to remember that economically, in the economic aspect, no bankers have been jailed for the 2008 financial crisis, despite widespread fraud and the looting of the American economy, which again resulted in mass unemployment, homelessness, and economic dislocation. Now, here is an amazing visual breakdown of the broken windows style of policing. So the broken windows theory is basically a specific style of policing. This targets low-level violations for intensive, invasive, and aggressive enforcement. Criminologist James Q. Wilson and George Kelling have existing research where there was, for example, a car that was left unattended on a street. But if just one window of the car is broken, the car is quickly vandalized. Now, the lesson here is that if cities want to maintain crime-free neighborhoods, they have to take action to ensure that the people feel this pressure to conform or adapt themselves to civilized norms of public behavior. And this is a prime example of disorderly actions in society, creating this fear of crime, and the policing system handles it through social control. The main idea of broken windows policing is that the best way to perform social control or establish order is to use the police to remind people in ways that these disorderly and antisocial behaviors are not okay. With the lack of control in regulating people's urges to perform disorderly actions, the solution took on this form of disciplinary social controls in hopes of creating community stability. But the question you may want to ask yourself throughout this presentation and now and after is this form of attacking crime being focused on social control, controlling communities. How can one trust in a system that wants to control them rather than work with them? Now, again, we're still diving into contemporary policing. So the tactic, as I mentioned earlier, involves this form of social control. To understand contemporary policing, one really needs to understand what counts as crime, as these policies are literally shaped by race and class inequality, as well as gender. These are all intersectional terms. When researching crime and policing tactics, take a look at the demographics or the internal reports, as some of these reports come from police officers or their districts. But remember, those districts or those police officers, they might hold bias towards what should be reliable data. Now, the criminal justice system itself also continues to ignore the crimes of the rich. And this is where class becomes a very important factor. When the crimes of the rich are dealt with, it's generally through administrative controls, civil enforcement, rather than aggressive policing, criminal prosecution, and incarceration, which are reserved largely for the poor and non-white. Remember, the role of policing has never changed. It's been professionalized, literally, as we see through this presentation over time, how the police are still deeply rooted in racism and literally shaped by race, class, and gender. It has been professionalized to appeal to the person as they transition from military use to what we might know, or for those that may not know, it's called COPS, community-oriented policing. Heads up, when you look at New Jersey's financial bill, or maybe possibly any other state bill, this is in regards to state and local politics, you will, under the law enforcement section of the bill, or the financial outline, the financial plan, you are able to see the amount of money allocated towards the community-oriented policing versus mental health services for students in school. And that's something to take into account, again, with understanding policing impacting other groups. Now, these two pictures here that you see, they show you how amplified the police is now as well, considering tear gas, more aggressive physical tactics, comparing to the beginning of the presentation with solely aggressive tactics, batons, and water cannons. I just want to make sure that we all understand that it is definitely becoming more amplified. And in regards to current events, you know, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually has introduced a bill to ban tear gas on federal, state, and local levels. Think about that, tear gas. Now, before we go into detail, I will be reading this quote from Alex Vital, the author of The End of Policing, and I will read it once more again. As poverty deepens and housing pricings rise, government support for affordable housing has evaporated, leaving in its wake a combination of homeless shelters and aggressive broken windows-oriented policing. As mental health facilities close, police become the first responders to calls for assistance with mental health crises. As the youth are left without adequate schools, jobs, or recreational facilities, they form gangs for mutual protection or participate in the black markets of stolen goods, drugs, and sex to survive, and are ruthlessly criminalized. And before, again, we move to the next slide, policing, again, itself has never changed. And it is merely professionalized to the point where your perspective, it's about your frame of mind, is being misperceived. There is a false front. The form of policing today is blinding and blocking your original frame of mind that you may or may not have had when we were discussing slave patrols in the beginning. It's not just about these physical police stations, it's about tearing these structures of society that cause harm to us. It is about redivesting and creating new structures that have new systems that will address the needs of the people through a race, class, gender lens. And these local governments have to reframe their mind when understanding these systems, as we are below them since they hold a higher position than us, being where they are, handling the law and the powers of the state. Now, again, this is a very important image to really understand the concept that Jasenia mentioned earlier about defunding the police. I'm going to read that quote one more time from Alex Vital. As poverty deepens and housing pricing rises, government support for affordable housing has evaporated, leaving in its wake a combination of homeless shelters and aggressive broken windows-oriented policing. As mental health facilities close, police become the first responders to calls for assistance with mental health crises. As youth are left without adequate schools, jobs, or recreational facilities, they form gangs for mutual protection or participate in the black markets, drugs, and sex to survive and are ruthlessly criminalized. Now, technology. We have come a very long way, and the advancement of technology plays a huge role in policing because recent protests, especially, police departments are now using social media as a way to identify protesters and arrest them for things like disorderly conduct or minor allegations. So people have to be sure to blur the videos out or download an app to blur the photos before posting them on Instagram. These police forces today utilize surveillance and technology systems to essentially heighten this fear of the public. And with this fear comes the understanding that, oh, the police are the authoritative power in their position. Therefore, the people must abide by their rules and procedures. However, this idea of entrapment is pursued through the advancement of technology. NYPD is actually a prime example, as the efforts of their intelligence division were specifically focused towards Muslim communities, singling out the Muslim community, religious leaders, student associations, mosques, businesses, and more. The NYPD was spying on these Muslim communities on the basis that the Muslim religious practices and beliefs are the groundwork of law enforcement scrutiny, as mentioned by the American Civil Liberties Union. And the ACLU has also reported, as well as other resources, that NYPD officers have recorded license plate numbers and utilized the advancement of the camera to be placed on light poles, which are directed at the mosque so they can see who enters and leaves their place of worship for possible suspects. And again, technology is used to market as a race neutral alternative. Very important term, because this idea is false, because behind each device is a person. Therefore, there's an alternative. This alternative is still unjust and upholds this racist criminal justice system. And the modern policing system itself today elevates these remnants of the historic patterns of violence through this other process level, which involves technology. And now this is a very amazing graph. Thank you to Sunrise Organization. This graph, here we have a beautiful flow chart from the Sunrise, which visually explains the tech tools used by police and the criminal justice system. I would highly suggest taking a closer look because, as Sunrise mentioned, making police seem nicer, kinder, or race neutral because of newly funded tech only distracts the frame of mind. Remember, it distracts from what they actually do, which is they control, repress, terrorize, and bring harm and violence into communities that don't hold controlling the police do. For example, after the murder of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising, we saw from the Obama administration, they introduced what is known as 21st century policing. They used body cameras and early predicting tools for problematic cops and more tech as well. But today, we see more drones, and with those factors like facial recognition software and infrared technology impeding on our civil rights. But also remember, it is the person behind those devices that the end judgment comes down to. And this graph really helps understand to what extent are these tools used and how they impact communities that are historically denied power. And before we get into the main takeaways, I want to make sure that we talk about framing your perspective again as we go through this presentation, considering we went from the deep roots of policing to what we see today. And as American lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw once says, if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem.
So that marks the end of our content. We really appreciate your attention. And basically what we want you guys to take away is that the three origins of policing were related to these three basic social arrangements of inequality, and that is slavery, colonialism, and the control of a new industrial working class. And also that while the specific forms of policing have changed, given the changing nature of inequality, the basic function of managing the poor, foreign, and non-white predominantly on behalf of a system of economic and political inequality remains. Or in other words, during that professionalization era of the 19th and 20th centuries, we saw the changes in training, leadership, various oversight mechanisms, but these left intact the basic institutional functions of police, which were never really about public safety or crime. And I love this quote by veteran police scholar David Bailey. "The police do not prevent crime. This is one of the best kept secrets of modern life. The experts know it, the police know it, but the public does not know it. Yet the police pretend that they are the society's best defense against crime and continually argue that if they are given more resources, especially personnel, they will be able to protect communities against crime." This is a myth. And lastly, the latest era or phase of policing is community policing. And this is when police want to tailor their work around the needs of the community. However, the issue with this is that it isn't directly a response to scholarly research showing time after time that an increase in police presence do not prevent crime. And also, community policing does not target the root causes or the root issues of the police and of social conditions. So that marks the end of our presentation. We are now going to open up for any questions or any thoughts you guys have.
And also just want to remind everyone, this is being recorded. And if you want us to follow up when the recording is available, make sure you drop your email in the chat box, and then we'll be following up with where the recording will be available. And yeah, if you have any questions, unmute yourself or just pop it in the chat box.
I think this just made me like actually realize how much information we don't learn in school and like how much it is whitewashed, because I feel like if I hadn't have come to this presentation, I wouldn't know anything about any of this. And it's like there's so much information that we have to search for and know something about to want to actually become knowledgeable on that. And that's like what I think is the issue with our education system. Like it's not an honest form of education, and a lot of the information that people might want to learn about, they don't even know what to ask. So how are you supposed to learn about something if you don't know what you're not learning about, right? So I don't know, this just made me realize like how much I don't know. And yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, like we touched upon it, like our view of police is shaped by so many things, mainstream media, but we didn't really mention it, but like education is a huge thing too. Day after day, we're seeing that, you know, what's taught in history class is completely whitewashed. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, Kaya, that it's absolutely true. And I think all of us in this kind of journey of like relearning our own history come to that realization where it's like, what the hell? Like, is everything that we learned a lie? Pretty much. I like have those thoughts like every day. But yeah, thank you for sharing.
Someone has a question in the chat from Elena. Does anyone have advice/thoughts on bridging the gap / reaching people of generations who believe police officers should be automatically respected because of their job? I personally think that a good tactic is maybe not focusing on the police themselves, but focusing on building alternative institutions. I think when, and we see here defunding the police, the or the other side of it, which is investing in these social institutions like education, recreation, employment, whatever it is, I think that it's more digestible for people.
Hi, I'm the person who asked the question, and just as a follow-up, because this is something I struggle with like older people in my own life and like my parents who really don't understand or get scared of the idea of, you know, defunding and abolishing. But I think it's a good idea to ask the question as well, like, is there still a place somehow for the idea of police in the community? And it kind of relates to that cartoon that was shown earlier. with that like little police dog carrying all the boulders. Like, is there a place for them still? Because that's what people often respond with, like, well, what about, and I know, you know, we just went over how they don't prevent crime, but are there places where they might be still needed, such as in responding to like domestic violence situations where that type of force might be needed? And, you know, we talked about how obviously they don't really like prevent or really help with rape, but I feel like there might be certain situations where some sort of force is needed. And I think that's what people who are so against the abolish or defund movements are really scared of.
Yeah, Elena.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, T.
Thank you, Elena, for sharing that. Just a little, maybe, you know, a little information. I hope this can help a little bit. You know, I work in the social services field. I work for the state of New Jersey for DCF, but I also work for a domestic violence shelter. And I believe that what could help when you're speaking to older individuals, whether it be grandparents or parents or coworkers, you know, maybe talk to them a little bit more about, do they know what their community has as far as resources, right? So I believe that if we're able to inform one another of the resources that's available in our own community and make them aware that these services that are here, these people are trained for, you know, whether it be mental health, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be DCP&P, former known as DIFUS, you know, we're trained for things like this. So, and for instance, if somebody were to say, well, you know, what about domestic violence call? You know, police may be needed for force. You're right, they may be needed for force. However, you know, if we can maybe change the narrative where the police are called as a standby, you know, to be there if needed, but to have the professionals who are trained in the matter come out, I think maybe we'll start to see more people understanding that. I don't think that many people are thinking immediately when you're hearing defund the police or get rid of the police, they're not thinking has so many resources, or they're not thinking, oh my God, my community is lacking these resources. So maybe if we start to have these conversations about what that person's town has or doesn't have, then they'll start to understand why we are having this conversation tonight. So I hope that helps a little bit.
I also
kind of want to
yeah.
Counter actually a little bit of what Tiana mentioned and bring up kind of like a counterpoint that maybe we can think about, is that I personally believe that we don't need cops at all, police, in these situations. In situations of domestic violence, cops tend to escalate instead of de-escalate a situation. So if we have, you know, trained social workers and trained professionals, we've seen that when they arrive at these kind of scenes, they are much more effective at de-escalating a domestic violence situation than a cop does. So in my opinion, I don't even think that cops need to be there. And in situations of rape, unfortunately, a lot of times when victims called in some like a rape situation, the rapists are no longer on the scene. So that we wouldn't need a cop on the scene of a rape. What we would need is something different. We would need, you know, like a detective, or we would need a forensic scientist to pick up the evidence, as opposed to a cop being there. And of course, in addition to some kind of like social worker or therapist to be with the victim. But I think once we start thinking outside the box and we say, hey, if almost like putting ourselves in those shoes, if I was in a domestic violence situation, who would I want there? I would want someone comforting. I wouldn't want the police, regardless if they were armed or unarmed, regardless if they were 10 feet away or 100 feet away. I personally would not want a police officer there. If we start thinking outside the box and literally think to ourselves, police no longer exist, what would be the resources that would answer or that would attend these kind of situations, we can start getting creative and we realize that we really don't need them. That's just my kind of input. Thank you so much for sharing your question, because it's definitely questions that everybody asks. You know, how do we start addressing these to folks that are so, you know, ingrained in their mind that this is the system that works and that this is the system that we must need.
I also quickly want to add is that for some of us, we may feel fear when we think of no police, but we have to keep in mind that there are other populations who don't even call the police. So for instance, when I worked for a nonprofit in Newark this semester, I learned that there is a significant population in Newark, no matter what happens to them, no matter whether they're assaulted, stolen from them, whatever it was, they just don't call the police. I was told by the mayor. So we have to think about, okay, this institution hasn't really been built for everyone, and you might try to reform it, but the trauma there, the generational trauma, is still intact. And I also think that Karina wanted to say something as well.
So just to clarify, something to really take into account that I wanted to stress even more throughout this presentation, throughout understanding policing, or other issues in general, you really have to understand how to decolonize yourself, understand where you're from, especially BIPOC communities and those that may have privilege. This notion about policing, yes, while we have been educated, especially in schools, like I'm sure many can attest to that, especially within the schools, we've been told like the police is where they keep us safe. Like if you have a problem, you can they will keep you safe. But you have to understand that literally throughout this presentation, it was so evident that every single action that the police like make is stemmed in racism. Everything, like the police itself is shaped, like it needs to be shaped by that. And you can't have, how are you going to have a structure that's supposed to protect people when the structure itself is not built for those people? And that's something you have to take and consider in your frame of mind, and really consider like intersectional aspects with policing, especially like this, like with race. Like you have to consider not just Black males, you have to consider like women that are Black, especially, or transgenders that are Black, who have also faced policing policing violence as well. I just want to make sure a key takeaway from tonight with what Marwa and Jasenia and everyone else mentioned, really it takes time to exfold and extract that information, but you really have to consider this narrative and really reforming is not solving the solution. When you have a problem with a friend and you're talking to them, you don't just like talk about it and like, oh, we'll fix it later next time. That's kind of almost like, you have to really solve the root issue. If you don't solve the root issue, then you're going to keep seeing these issues over and over again, and it'll be a continuous cycle of oppression and repressive actions towards BIPOC people.
Did we answer everyone's questions? I want to make sure, because lots is happening in the chat right now.
And
The chat is popping off right
now.
now.
There was
Jinx, Jasenia.
there was one question from Fabrice. Let me see if I can pull it up. Why? I can't find the exact wording, but he was asking of how do we get people to use their imaginations in a way that saying this correctly. So let me see if I can find it.
I put it back in the chat.
Yeah, there you go.
So he says, how do we expand the radical imaginations of people? It seems that most people are against abolition or defunding because they view the police as an immovable component of our society. Sorry, I just lost it. Like Elena said, older generations just think that we can't get rid of the police because they were always there. Long story short, how do we not make this seem as if we are not moving the mountain that police abolition, so like that police abolition is attainable? That's a really great question. Does anybody want to take a try at it?
I think when talking to older people, one of the first things is to help them recognize where they may be either biased or privileged, because speaking to a lot of senior citizens here in Jersey City who are Black, they understand what defund the police means. They understand the desire for less police in the community. But when you talk to seniors of other races, they're terrified because they feel they need protection. But that's a part of the privilege that is unseen to them. They don't realize that there is a segment of a population in every single city in this country that is being terrorized by the police instead of protected by the police. And I think getting them to understand that first before you have the conversation about what defunding means and what it means to abolish the police, when you get them to understand the segments of the population that are terrorized first, I think they'll be more open to hearing the idea of why resources need to be reallocated and some communities want less police.
I completely agree. Thank you so much for your feedback. And I'd love to touch upon that, what you mentioned of like older folks, particularly like in the Black community, and that they very well understand the concept of defunding the police and police abolition. I find it incredibly useful, and I'm so thankful because Black elders have really helped shape the way that I think nowadays. And I think tapping into them is so important. And a lot of times we think that the ideas that we have nowadays are super radical and super new, but I mean, the Black Panthers had these ideas, you know, former enslaved folks had these ideas as well. You know, all this is being carried on through history, just like policing has. The ideas that we're currently discussing have been passed down through history as well. So instead of trying to remake the wheel, let's just learn from our predecessors, let's learn from our elders, and try to maybe even improve on what they had. But I also think it's really important to realize that it took us time to unlearn and relearn our history, and that's a lifelong process. We realistically are not going to get folks to become abolitionists in one day, but we can, you know, shift their gears after a few conversations and after having constant education. So having patience, I've even found that with my parents. My parents are Latinx immigrants, you know, that they have some of their own biases as well. And, you know, just having an open dialogue with them now, like my dad's pretty much an abolitionist too, like, you know, having these conversations with elders and just trying to find, someone mentioned it previously, where the biases lie, and then trying to take it from that angle. But that's a really great question. And it's hard. I mean, there's really no straightforward answer. Does anybody else have any kind of input that they have? Kaya,
sorry.
Oh, no. Amal, please go ahead.
I know one good way is like taking like the fact of like if these people like typically older folks know more about the American history and what has made the country, and relating to this type of revolution as the revolution we had back when America was made, you know, relating the crimes that are happening today as like what the crimes like the looting and all of that type of stuff to like when literally millions or like a whole bunch of millions of pounds of tea were, you know, dropped out in the whole Boston Tea Party, and relating to that and being like, oh, like that wasn't seen as criminal, this shouldn't be seen as criminal, it's a revolution. And kind of going at that route where America connecting revolutions and making it seem as like as if that this isn't like just because it's like, you know, Black people that it's bad. It should be, it's relative, like it relates to like a revolution, I guess, making it more a grand scheme type of thing.
Well, I think we're going to take one final question or comment because we have roughly 7 minutes left and we want to end this presentation on a very quick exercise.
Marwa, I see Kaya has her hand up.
Yeah, Kaya?
All I was going to say was that I think it's really difficult to relate to events that happen in other people's lives if you're not exposed to them. So I think for a lot of people, no matter what sort of generation you are, if you don't hear about, like I wouldn't say lucky necessarily, but because I'm biracial, like half my family's Black. So I know the struggles and I know the stories of what they go through, but a lot of times people aren't exposed to those stories or those particular struggles. Like even the white side of my family, the conversations, my parents are divorced, so they're not together anymore, so I don't have the same sort of conversations, but the kind of conversations that I have on one side are very different than the conversations that I have on another. Like with the white side of my family, it's like my mom, she's like, but are still good. And I'm like, yeah, except I have cousins and grandparents and uncles and people who in my family who are afraid of the police, you know, like, so check yourself, you know what I mean? Like look at where you're coming from and look at where they're coming from and maybe try to see their point of view. Because just because you live in a world where you're comfortable and you don't have to be afraid of the police doesn't mean that other people aren't. So
thank you for that. That was really insightful. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions or comments, but we appreciate all of them so far.
Yeah, and we also, in our other series, we can take more questions. You know, stay tuned to our other events because we'll definitely keep this conversation going.
So for the final thing of this presentation, we want to do a very quick exercise within the last 5 minutes. What makes you feel safe? You can feel free to say it out loud or feel free to drop it in the chat as well.
Controlling my own destiny.
I think knowledge and being like self-aware. I think that's what makes me feel safe.
Having a system that works with me and doesn't rip my family apart.
honesty.
Active listening. I'm seeing a lot of community in the group chat, open-mindedness, people I can trust, people who want to learn.
For me, it's knowing that I'm valued.
I also think it's important to right now, even if you don't have a quick response to this, it's good for the next couple of minutes just to meditate on this question and think about it.
Masks are definitely very, very important.
Someone said, to be honest, with the amount of privilege I have, I don't often feel unsafe, and I wish that for everyone. Thank you for your honesty and your truth.
Another one for me would be access to healthcare and to services.
I see listening to a wide range of perspectives, and that's really important so we can start those conversations that we mentioned towards good solutions that actually solve the root issues.
The freedom of access of information, that's a really good one.
This is really powerful. Nobody chooses the position they are in, so we can't make people feel guilty if they were born with privilege because they can't help that. So I would say even like born with privilege or born without, we're all human. We all breathe the same air.
Being loved, my people, and loving other people.
Now we're slowly going to transition. Thank you so much for everyone's response and for also being very vulnerable and trusting in this warm space. I'm going to pass it off to T and Jasenia to reconvene back to this image.
So that I want you guys to just take a look at this image. Just drop in the chat. Looking at these pictures, can you tell what
It goes downstairs.
pictures were from today in age, or can you tell what pictures took place back in the 60s? If so, how many pictures do you think are of today? Do you think all of these are from a while back? Some people are saying they're all Sally the same. Could be from any time, all except corner bottom right. 8, the only difference is the clothing. They're all different but carry the same message. Half and half, but all the same message. 2 or 3 are older. 4 from the past. It just shows how long this fight has been going on. Yes.
We also just want to take this moment to honor these folks on the screen, all the other ones that we couldn't fit on the screen, which is just as heartbreaking, and all the ones that we don't even know, that we never got to learn their names, that we never got to learn their stories. So we just want to, wrap it up and take this second to really just honor these folks, honor their presence, and honor their story. And so, folks, thank you so much for joining us today. These are a few links that have further resources for further educating yourself on the topics that we discussed today. And there are countless more on behalf of myself and on behalf of Black Lives Matter Morristown. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. We will be having some more webinars and more parts of this series that we hope you all can join us as well. We'll be announcing those on all different kinds of, on all of our social media platforms. T, Marwa, Karina, if you have any last words, anything else you want to say, please feel free.
Yeah, I just personally want to thank everyone that came out. I mean, we had over 80 people come and listen, and we had over 60 people sit to the entire time through our presentation, and it means a lot to us. A lot was put into this, and so I want to thank Marwa and Karina for reaching out and giving BLM Morristown the opportunity to work on this with them. That was amazing. And Jasenia for taking on so many roles with this presentation. Mickey, thank you. Paige, Heather, thank you for all that you guys have contributed with this presentation and this event. Very successful. So thank you guys again, and I hope you guys can take anything from this event and share. Was a negative, whether it was a positive, whether you are indifferent, just share something with someone else. So next time we meet with all of you, we can have more conversations. This chat was popping. I love it. So again, thank you.
And also a quick thank you as well to the Roosevelt Institute, to Karina and Marwa for reaching out to BLM Morristown, for collaborating with us. This literally could not have been possible. This presentation could not have been possible without the help of you both. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for BLM Morristown. It was wonderful to have their resources and knowledge. I appreciate everyone coming. I was very happy to see lots of people, and I hope that you can take away something substantial from this. We do plan to share these slides with, if you sent your email in the chat box. We definitely recommend checking out the works cited and also the other resources on the page. A work that we drew upon a lot was The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. He's a sociology professor, and I really look up to him. And again, he's coming to Drew next semester, so keep an eye out to that. I'm very excited. And I just want to give a final round of thank you.
And also, I just want to say thank you guys to everyone that came out. We were all concerned about how many people would show up, but I'm really excited to see that people are very consistent, and everyone took the opportunity to come today to be really vulnerable. And I really respect and appreciate that, because this is a warm space. So for all those that shared, that took the time today to really go through this process of really understanding, unraveling, and unpacking these things, it's a very emotional process for some people. And thank you so much. And big shout out to BLMM. We had a great time working with you guys. And also make sure to follow both accounts. Please follow BLMM. Their contact information is also in the presentation. They will follow up, as well as follow Drew Roosevelt Institute. We won't be on campus, obviously, but we are working on remote projects towards policing, as well as our statewide campaign to defund the police. So please contact us if you have any more questions for that. And thank you guys again for everything today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Make sure to self-care. Have a great evening and happy holidays if you celebrate. Bye,
Be
everyone.
safe.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.